The Millennia stories of Brian Aldiss. It's very windy outside, so you might hear something in the background. An Hegelian perspective. A monstrous reification of the absolute. All will become clear, hopefully. The Star Millennia, a story originally called Incentive, more than a decade after the beginning of Israel's exile, as told in the Dark Millennia. See my previous video. The Galactics have come to Earth and established an embassy in New Union. Pharaoh Westerby visits the embassy to confront John Denaga Tlate Robinson and endeavours to discover the real reason that Earth is being admitted into the Galactic Federation. John Denaga acquaints Pharaoh with the Galactic's immaterialist understanding of reality and informs him that Earth is being drawn into the Federation as an act of psychotherapy, an exorcising of monsters from the id, so to speak. But that is open to interpretation. In fact, I will give a different take to it. But anyway, mustn't get ahead of myself. So what is the incentive? The narrative is interspersed with an account of a column of lemmings making their way to the sea. This has great symbolic significance. A human observer would have said they swam bravely, and unavoidably he would have asked himself, to what goal do the lemmings imagine they are heading? For what illusion are they prepared to throw away their lives? So, this is Pharaoh speaking now. I haven't fully explained why I think the Federation would be such a bad thing for Earth. Pharaoh is an isolationist. He doesn't want Earth to join the Federation. We are progressing on our own. Eventually, we shall develop our own method of space travel and come to join you on a more equal footing. Jan Denaga shook his head. Space travel between different star systems, is not just a matter of being able to build starships. Any post-nuclear culture can stumble on that trick. Space travel is a state of mind. The journey is always hell, and you never find a planet, however lovely, that suits you as well as the one in which you were born. You need an incentive. What sort of incentive? Have you any idea? I take it you're not referring to interstellar trading or conquest. Correct. I'm afraid I don't know what sort of an incentive you mean. Well, let's find out. I told you, actually, the Galactic Federation have an immaterialist philosophy. So, one of the questions we need to ask before we get into this is the distinction between subjectivity and objectivity, as will become clear. So, there's a quote here from Hegel's Phenomenology. In my view, which can only be justified by the exposition of the system itself, everything turns on grasping and expressing the truth, not only as substance, but equally as subject. At the same time, it is to be observed that substantiality embraces the universal, or the immediacy of knowledge itself, as well as that which is being or immediacy for knowledge. If the conception of God as the one substance shocked the age in which it was proclaimed, the reason for this was, on the one hand, an instinctive awareness that in this definition, self-consciousness was only submerged and not preserved. On the one hand, the opposite view, which clings to thought, to universality as such, immaterialist philosophy here, is the very same. Simplicity is undifferentiated, unmoved substantiality, and if, thirdly, thought does unite itself with the being of substance, and apprehends immediacy or intuition as thinking, the question is still whether this intellectual intuition does not again fall back into inert simplicity and does not depict actuality itself in a non-actual manner. Because this is what Pharaoh is about, and the guy from the Federation, whose name I can't remember, they're talking about what actuality is in itself, actually like. Further, the living substance is being, which is in truth subject, or what is the same, is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of positing itself, or is the mediation of its self-othering with itself. The substance is, as subject, pure, simple negativity, and is for this very reason the bifurcation of the simple. It is a doubling which sets up opposition, and then again the negation of this indifferent diversity, and of its antithesis, the immediate simplicity. Only this self-restoring sameness, or this reflection in otherness, within itself, and not an original or immediate unity as such, is the true. It is the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as a goal, having its end also as its beginning, and only by being worked. So, substance as subject. Paragraph 18 is in essence a list indicating that substance is the same as subject and subject is the same as the terms he provides us with. Such statements of the speculative identity of seemingly different thoughts occur throughout the preface to the Phenomenology. Hegel's intent is to upset the boundaries that we draw between so-called subjects and so-called objects. We apprehend enough of the meaning of the individual terms for the mere assertion of their identity to trouble us. Hard work is required for us to see speculative identities. This is where Faro is at. He is not there by a long way, which will prove rather deadly for him. Science is only in its beginning stages, and it has not yet attained Wirklichkeit, actuality. When we wish, this is from the Phenomenology again, when we wish to see an oak with its massive trunk and spreading branches and foliage, we are not content to be shown an acorn instead. So too, science, the crown, or a world of spirit, is not complete in its beginnings. The onset of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture, the prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path, and of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. So, back to the story. Faro is instructed to don a special mask, which is interesting, called the synthesizer. I suppose I could have made something of that, but as we all know, as you are Hegel scholars, thesis, antithesis, synthesis isn't Hegel anyway. But anyway, I could have made something out of the synthesizer, but forget that. It is a type of wave synthesizer. In effect, it renders down many of the wavelengths which man cannot detect by himself, translating them into paraphrased terms which he can. At the same time, it feeds its objective and subjective impressions of the universe. That is to say, you will experience when you wear the mask, and I switched on, instrumental recordings of the universe, visual and oral and so on, as well as human impressions of it. I should warn you that owing to your lack of training, you may unfortunately gather a rather confused impression from the synthesizer. All the same, I fancy that it will give you a better rough idea of what the galaxy is like than you would get from a long star journey. I understand nothing, he said. I don't understand why it should be your duty to look after Earth. Then already you do begin to understand, John the Naga said. And for the first time personal warmth tempered his voice. For not only are our sciences beyond yours, so are our philosophies and thought disciplines. All our mental abilities have been keyed semantically into the language in which you have learned to converse with me. Galingua. Note: objective, subjective impressions of the universe. A deeper study of immediate knowing requires a third way, which is neither immediacy nor external mediation, but self-mediation. The process of becoming itself is self-moving. Divine self-sameness is not absent from the constant change we witness in supposedly finite things, and to show this we can take these supposedly finite things, each by each, and demonstrate how any claim about them makes implicit reference to their selfhood, a capacity to self-relate. Since it is impossible to run through all the finite things, we must content ourselves with a systematic presentation of their major kinds: the logical, the natural, and the geistic, or spiritual. And the system of science as envisaged by Hegel. This is science in Wissenschaft in a more general sense. This is what it gives us. In this manner, it takes seriously the empiricist's interest in finitude and limitation, while also honouring the immediatists, someone who believes you can have an immediate access to reality, insistence that the highest truth is purely self-involved. The immediatist will go beyond this and insist that the divine is so self-involved that it cannot enter into the finite at all. But that is only a reasonable hypothesis if the structure of thinking, the whole moving natural world, and the entirety of human history, habit and endeavour, do not contradict it. And to the extent that the world is meaningful, it in some way grants the recognition of identity and difference, constancy in perpetual change. Wirklichkeit. Hegel, in the preface to the Phenomenology, highlights a problem with formalism. Formalism considers the form as separate from content and as true on its own, even without the content. The formula on its own is taken as the completion, and the rest is mere details. In the discussion of formalism, Hegel notes that the science is only in its beginning stages and has not yet attained Wirklichkeit. Wirklichkeit is usually translated as actuality, albeit the English word suggests merely a portion of its scope. The word is related to Werking, to function or operate or to act on something, and Wirkung, an effect, force or action. Back to our story. Your language is certainly comprehensive and complex, Fowler said. He's talking about Galingua. But perhaps my knowledge of it is too elementary for me to recognize the extra significance of which you speak. That is only because you have still to be shown how Galingua is more than a language, how it is a way of life, our means of space travel itself. Concentrate on what I am telling you, Mr. Westerby. Confusedly, Fowler shook his head as the other spoke. Blood seemed to be congested at the base of his skull, and the odd idea came to him that he was losing his character, his identity. Wisps of meaning, hints of greater comprehension blew through his brain like streamers in a draught of a fan. As he tried to settle them, keep them steady, his own language became less like the bedrock of his being. His knowledge of Galingua, coupled with the experience of the last hour, gradually assumed a dominant tone. With Jadanagar's grave eyes upon him, he began to think in the tongue of the galaxy. Right, back to my commentary. The word Wirklichkeit, I've said this already, I'm just reminding you, is related to werken, to function, operate, and to act on something, and Wirkung, an effect, force, or action. Both of these derive from the root werk, which is like our word work. It stems from the same Indo-European root we see in the ancient Greek argon, work. This is the root from which Aristotle forms the word important for an understanding of the being of being, energia, to be at work or to be active. Aristotle comes to the conclusion, after considering several available options, that to be is to act or to do, to perform one's being or oneself in an ongoing way. This Aristotelian ontological insight is important for Hegel's thinking. The whole preface of the Phenomenology presents a defense of this insight in modern terms. For instance, substance is subject. Energia is the word that is translated into Latin as actuality by maintaining a connection to Wirken and Wirkung. Wirklichkeit preserves the sense that actuality is only actual by being active and effective. Wirklichkeit preserves the relationship between being and activity present in energia. It may be objected that Aristotle's energia and Hegel's subject are related but ultimately very different conceptions, but both are ways of talking about the same ontological performance, namely selfhood. It is possible that motions toward the kind of selfhood will be kinetic, but the ongoing activity of being that self will be energia, and so energia and subject name the same activity of selfing. The absolute is subject. Substance and subject. Proper speculative science can be distinguished from these other views. Prioritizing abstract substance, which we find in Spinoza, prioritizing abstract subject in Kant, prioritizing the abstract intellectual intuition of their union, such as we find with Schelling. Now, the first position can make no transition from being to thinking usually because it reduces thinking to being and denies the freedom of thinking, for instance, materialism. This is why Fowler is going to have a real problem with understanding what he's experiencing in the synthesizer. The second position can make no transition from thinking to being, usually because it holds that thinking is free and being nature is determined, for instance, dualism. Now, the third position, which is intellectual intuition, claims to solve this problem of transition, but it can only assert the abstract or indeterminate union of substance and subject. It cannot develop this since the very premise of an immediate intellectual intuition precludes mediation and development. This cannot succeed because all human knowledge is mediated. With the failure of the third position, we realize we need a concrete account of how substance and subject interact and develop. This is where Jan Denago is at. This is what he's trying to get to teach to Pharaoh. By this account, non-self-relating being substance will be grasped and expressed as self-relating being or selfhood, which is a subject. What the subject is, negativity. To be anything at all is to become oneself by means of self-othering, negativity. Paragraph 18 of the Phenomenology presents speculative content directed towards disclosing truth, both for being and for thinking, as self-relation through negation. There is thereby a chain of speculative propositions. Living substance is being is subject is movement of self-positing is mediation of becoming other than with itself, becoming other with itself is pure simple negativity. Pure simple negativity is division of the simple. Division of the simple is oppositional doubling. Oppositional doubling is negation of indifferent difference and its opposite. Negation of indifferent difference and its opposite is self-restoring sameness. Self-restoring sameness is reflection of being other than into itself. Reflection of being other into itself is the circular movement whereby something becomes itself. We must grasp subject with substance, which is being, as subject, which is self-relation, and as negativity, self-othering. This is compared to a circle, since a circle comes back to itself only by going away from itself. He looks like he's enlightened. With that woman above him. Yes, blood too. Anyway, back to the phenomenology of spirit. Thus, the life of God and the divine cognition may well be spoken of as a disporting of love with itself, but this idea sinks into mere edification and even insipidity if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labour of the negative. In itself, that life is indeed one of untroubled equality and union with itself, for which otherness and alienation and overcoming of alienation are not serious matters. The life of God is not just pure removed self-contemplation. God lives in and through creating life. The restless movement of life demands expression through self-alienation and return to self. God lives in the hard work of self-othering or the negative. Even God requires mediation, or rather is by self-mediating, all of which suggests a new way of thinking about mediation. Right, back to the phenomenology. This will all come together, I assure you. The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result. That is a very important point. Not only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, namely, to be actual, subject, the spontaneous becoming of itself. Though it may seem contradictory that the absolute should be conceived essentially as a result, it needs little pondering to set this show of contradiction in its true light. The beginning, the principle of the absolute, as at first immediately enunciated, is only the universal, just as when I say all animals. This expression cannot pass for zoology, so it is equally plain that the words the divine, the absolute, the eternal, etc. do not express what is contained in them, and only such words in fact do express the intuition as something immediate. Whatever is more than such a word, even the transition to a mere proposition, contains a becoming other that has to be taken back, or is a mediation, but it is just this that is rejected with horror if the absolute cognition were being surrendered when more is made of mediation than in simply saying that it is nothing absolute and is completely absent in the absolute. The language of Galingua, of course, well, it's not really told to us what it is, but it obviously overcomes these difficulties. And notice where it says it is rejected with horror, and that is going to happen literally to Pharaoh, as we shall see. He's going to encounter something horrible. Mediation, and the absolute is the result, or end. But the result properly grasped is all the developmental work that made the result come about. That is, mediations. Words taken on their own in the absence of experience, that should say. Words taken on their own in the absence, there's always one mistake somewhere. Words taken on their own in the absence of experience do not count as knowledge. Think of Galingua again. The absolute is self-mediating as opposed to immediate. Back to the phenomenology. This abhorrence, which we're going to encounter soon, in fact stems from ignorance of the nature of mediation and of absolute cognition itself, for mediation is nothing beyond self-moving self-sameness, or its reflection into self, the movement of the I, which is for itself pure negativity, or when reduced to its pure abstraction, simple becoming. The I, or becoming in general, this mediation on account of its simple nature, is just immediacy, in the process of becoming, and is this immediate itself. Reason is therefore misunderstood when reflection is excluded from the true, and is not grasped as a positive moment of the absolute. It is reflection that makes the true a result, but it is equally reflection that overcomes the antithesis between the process of its becoming and the result. Therefore this becoming is also simple, and therefore not different from the form of the true, which shows itself as simple in its result. The process of becoming is rather just this return into simplicity. Though the embryo is indeed itself a human being, it is not for itself. This only is as cultivated reason, which has made itself into what it is in itself, and that is when it for the first time is actual. But this result is itself a simple immediacy, for it is self-conscious freedom at peace with itself, which has not yet set the antithesis on the one side and left it lying there, but has been reconciled with it. Mediation by the self. Those that reject mediation in philosophy do not apprehend it correctly. True mediation is not an adulteration of some pure truth by something foreign to it, but the self-unfolding development we witness so clearly in living things. The purpose of the human embryo is to become a reasoning adult. The otherness of these two contents, the embryo, being and matter, and reason, thinking and mind, is overcome through the self-mediation of the content itself, the activity of being human. What has just been said can also be expressed by saying that reason is purpose of activity, the exaltation of a supposed nature over a misconceived thinking and especially the rejection of external teleology, has brought the form of purpose in general into discredit. Still, in the sense in which Aristotle too defines nature as purposive activity, purpose is what is immediate and at rest, the unmoved which is also self-moving, and as such is subject. Its power to move, taken abstractly, is being for self or pure negativity. The result is the same as the beginning, only because the beginning is the purpose. In other words, the actual is the same as its notion, only because the immediate as purpose contains the self or pure actuality within itself. The realized purpose, or the existent actuality, is movement and unfolded becoming, but it is just this unrest that is the self, and the self is like that immediacy and simplicity of the beginning, and because it is the result, that which has returned into itself, the latter being similarly just to self. And the self is the sameness and simplicity that relates itself to itself. Reason is purpose of activity. Philosophers, like the British empiricists, materialist philosophers, that is, because after all we're distinguishing between materialism and immaterialism here, have recently raised the study of purposelessness, mechanical nature of the study of thinking, treated as mere subjective psychology, and discredited the study of purposes in nature altogether. But just as mediation is self-mediation, purpose means the activity of each self towards itself. Hence, what Hegel means by subject is what Aristotle meant by identifying nature with purposive activity. Purposes highlight activity, unrest, self-overcoming, not tranquil, nor static essences. This abhorrence in fact stems from ignorance of the nature of mediation and of absolute cognition itself. Abhorrence indeed. Back to our story. Freedom was not a condition he knew, that's Pharaoh, because it did not exist in his interpenetrated existence. As he swam up to the surface, something stirred beyond the yellow rim of the galaxy. The something could hardly be seen, but it was there on the outside, wakeful and clawed, a creature with senses, though insensate. It registered itself half as sight, half as noise, a smouldering and delayed series of pops, like the sound of bursting arteries. It was big. Pharaoh screamed into the blackness of his mask at its bigness and its anger. The creature was waiting for the man, stretched right around the galaxy, around the goldfish bowl, its supernatant bat's wings groping for purchase. Pharaoh screamed again. "I'm sorry," he said weakly as he felt the minister removing his mask for him. "I'm sorry." With Jandanaga's grave eyes upon him, he began to think in the tongue of the galaxy. For Jandanaga was talking, and with increasing rapidity. Although his meaning seemed clear, it felt to Pharaoh as if they were being comprehended only by a level below his conscious one. It was like partial drunkenness, when the grand simplicities of the world are revealed in wine, and the mind skates over the thin ice of experience. For Jandanaga was talking of many things at once, shifting things that could not be spoken of in terrestrial tongues, dissolving mental disciplines never formulated through terrestrial voices. Yet all these things balanced together in one sentence like jugglers' balls, enhancing each other. For Jandanaga was talking of only one thing, the thrust of creation. He spoke of what the synthesizer had demonstrated, that man was never a separate entity, merely a solid within a solid, or better still, a flux within a flux, that he had only subjective identity, that the wheeling matter of the galaxy was one with him. Well, we all know what that is, don't we? The absolute. The thing in the synthesizer, Pharaoh said to Jandanaga, through the newfound medium of communication. The thing that surrounds the galaxy. If man can never get out, cannot it get in at us? By not understanding, and then by well understanding, you have made yourself use of one of the true citizens of the galaxy. But you have only taken leap X, now you must take leap X10. Prepare yourself. I'm prepared. All that you have learned is true, Yet there is a far greater truth, a truer truth. Nothing exists in the ultimate sense, all is illusion, a two-dimensional shadow play on the mist of space-time. Yenisfar itself means illusion. Yenisfar is the name the Galactic Federation gave to Earth. And now we know why, I think. But the Claude thing is what we fare ever farther out into the illusion of space. It is real. Only the galaxy as you previously misinterpreted is unreal, being but a configuration of mental forces. That monster, that thing that you sensed, is the residue of the slime of the evolutionary past still lingering, not outside you, but in your own mind. It is from that we must escape. We must grow from it. Okay. So the Claude thing is a monster from the id. An actual monster. Like in the movie Forbidden Planet. Which I'm sure you've all seen. Hardly. We are dealing with a greater degree of sophistication and masterly storytelling here. Rather, it is a monstrous reification of the absolute. The absolute is substance and subject, remember? And it is a result. A result of what? Cognition and mediation. So that depends on how well we understand both mediation and cognition. Fowler encountered the absolute through this particular phase of his subjective understanding. Subjective. Not subjective and objective, which is the ultimate, the absolute. Now, as Hegel explains in the Encyclopedia Logic, spirit is not resting, but much more the absolutely restless, pure activity, the negating of the ideality of all fixed determinations of the understanding, not abstract simply, but in its simplicity, at the same time itself, from itself differentiating. Reason is purpose of activity. Thought is being. So this Claude thing has purposes. Which it's like the image of the purposes of in Pharaoh's understanding. So, back to the story then. The Claude thing is why we fare ever farther ahead into the illusion of space. It is real, only the galaxy, as you previously misinterpreted, is real. I think I'm repeating myself here, being but the configuration of mental forces. Now, I could have brought in a whole discussion about Hegel's discussion of force and understanding from the phenomenology, but this video is already too long. And anyway, I don't want to complicate matters. That monster, that thing you sensed, is the residue of the slime of the evolutionary past still lingering, not outside you, but in your own mind. It is from that you must escape. We must grow from it. More explanation followed, but it was beyond Pharaoh. In a flash, he saw that Jandanage, with an eagerness to experiment, had driven him too far and too fast. He could not make the last leap. He was falling back, toppling into not being. Somewhere within him, the pop thud, pop sound of bursting arteries began. Remember the characterization of the Claude thing. It was described in a similar manner. Because, like I said, it's his own mind. Others would succeed where he had failed, but meanwhile the angry claws were reaching from the heavens for him to sunder, not to rescue. So we finished with the lemmings. You've probably forgotten about them. And now the lemmings were scattered over a considerable area of sea. Few of the original column were left. The remaining swimmers, isolated from each other, were growing tired, yet they pressed forward as doggedly as ever toward the unseen goal. Nothing was ahead of them. They had lodged themselves into the vast, but not infinite, world without landmarks. The cruel incentive urged them always on, And if an invisible spectator had asked himself the agonized why to it all, an answer might have occurred to him that these creatures were not heading for some special promise in their future, but merely fleeing from some terrible fear in their past. What is the incentive? Well, I see the vast but not infinite world, because the absolute is the finite within the infinite. As the absolute, they're emerging with the absolute. Anyway, that's probably rather a bit fanciful, but the end. With a appropriate look on his face expressing mystification. What was that all about?